Hi, my name is Scott Starker. This is a course called How to Interpret the Bible. This is the 8th video, and it's entitled Genre, Apocalyptic. In the last session, we talked about narrative, epistle, and letters. Biblical narratives are stories about historical people, but the authors interpret the text. Narrative studies recognize that meaning is found in a text as a whole rather than in isolated segments. Telling a story takes a plot, characters, dialogue, and dramatic tension. In every sense, biblical narrative is theology seen in relationship and enacted in story form. It takes both exegetical research and literary analysis to form a good hermeneutic. An epistle is a document intended for a wider audience, whereas the letter is just intended for one. Epistles and letters have usually 5 things in common: salutation, thanksgiving and/or prayer, body, exhortation and instruction, and conclusion. All epistles and letters have problems which the authors intend to correct. It is critical, but the task is difficult to identify problems behind some of the statements in the epistles and letters. We dare not read individual statements or verses as finished dogma, but rather we must move from the material statements to ascertain the biblical theology and then develop a dogmatic or systematic theology. We must study theological development and the situation and use the different subgenres to do this. It is true that the smaller the passage, the greater the chance of error. For most people, apocalyptic literature represents one of the most fascinating and yet most mystifying portions of Scripture. When studying Daniel or Revelation, readers feel they have been transported into a fairy tale world of myths and monsters, a Tolkien-type panorama of fantasy. The unreality of the symbols and the constant shifting from one mysterious scene to another is greatly confusing. At the same time, the text portrays the war in heaven and on earth, between good and evil, between the children of God and the forces of Satan. The reader is caught between the literal and the symbolic, not knowing quite how to approach these works. Once we know how to handle the locusts and the demonic hordes, the many-horned goats and fearsome beasts, Apocalyptic is a fascinating and persevere vehicle for the presentation of theological truth. Like biblical narrative, apocalyptic cuts across the Testaments. In the Old Testament, we would note Daniel and Zechariah, as well as the visions of Ezekiel, chapters 37 through 39. New Testament apocalyptic might include the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13 and parallels, 1 Corinthians 15, 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 Peter 3, Jude, and obviously the book of Revelation. This material covers a period extending from the 7th century BC to the 2nd century AD. The term apocalypse was not used of this body of literature until it appeared in the book of Revelation, and it was not until the 2nd century that the term regularly appeared for this genre. The word meant to reveal or uncover knowledge previously hidden, and so was a natural term to employ. The literacy communication of apocalyptic, hidden truths are in order to bring the reader into line with God's control of history is a uniform pattern. The book of Revelation is a carefully conceived work with a distinct structure, and each element moves the reader forward in developing the basic apocalyptic thesis of God's sovereign control over history. There are constant ethical pronouncements, but they are more positive, calling the people of God to endurance and righteous living in light of the visions. Compare Revelation 16 verses 15, 22, verse 7. The saints were constantly called to an awareness and faith in the God who controls present and future. The readers recognized that moral demands of God here and now. Their one aim was to obey God and to carry out His commandments. In one sense, the book of Revelation as a whole centers on the need of the saints to be overcomers. Note the conclusion of each of the 7 letters, rather than cowardly, 21 verse 8. Another item in the formal feature is that esoteric, in other words, requiring or exhibiting knowledge that is restricted to a small group. Symbolism is the most visible quality of apocalyptic literature. The source of these symbols also differs from the prophets and other biblical writers. The latter drew their symbols or metaphors from the experiential world, such as locusts, horses, salt, lamps. Apocalyptics would do so as well, but added many symbols from the world or fantasy or myth, such as many-headed beasts, dragons, locusts, with tails of scorpions. However, these symbols were drawn from the time of the writers, and many quickly became conventional. For example, animals stood for men, cosmic signs for supernatural phenomena, and numbers for God's control over history. Also, the significance of numerology is particularly striking. In all apocalypses, the numbers 3, 4, 7, 10, 12, and 70 predominate. For instance, the book of Revelation is dominated by the number 7 and its multiples. At times, this can be frustrating, such as in the mystifying use of 666 in Revelation 13, verse 18. We will not know the meaning of that symbol for certain until we get to heaven, although it was probably well known to the readers. Dr. Osborne's own preference is to think that 666 refers to Nero Caesar. The letters of his name in Hebrew, if assigned numerical values, add up to 666. The rich profusion of symbols leads to great confusion among interpreters. The problem is that while many ancient apocalyptic works provide an interpretation, others do not. We cannot begin to make sense of apocalyptic without coming to grips with the background and meaning of such symbols. A recital of history is featured in many apocalyptic works, like Jubilees, the year at the end of 7 years, where the Hebrew slaves and prisoners would be freed, debts would be canceled, etc., that intertwine past and future. Several preoccupy themselves with the details of world history, especially that of Israel, Daniel 2, 7 through 12. This distinguishes these works from prophecy, which really relies on historical facts. The purpose is to demonstrate the divine control over all history on behalf of the people of God. This can be past history or the immediate future. Both come together to show the sovereignty of God. By reflecting upon God's control of the past, Israel or the church is asked to trust Him in the present. The same God who was sovereign over the past history is sovereign over present and future history. Israel need not fear the disasters of the present world or the world empires of the future. Nothing takes place without the foreknowledge and constant consent of God. This has been proven in the past and will be reiterated in the future. Characteristics. We can see clearly several aspects in a majority of the works. Pessimism towards the present age may be the dominant characteristic. Most who attempt to Laban situation in the life of Israel that gave rise to the movement believe that apocalypticism developed in a time of great crisis and peril for the nation. The situations were so desperate that there could be little hope for the present. All the child of God could do await God's future intervention. The prophet argued that if Israel returned to God, the condition would be met and the prophecy of doom avoided. The apocalyptists could offer no such optimistic forecasts, but could only comfort the reader that God in the future would bring contemporary history to a close and vindicate His people. In a very real sense, one could say that the apocalypticists had a healthy respect for the depravity of humanity. They soundly rejected the falsely optimistic view of the progress of society and placed their trust not in man, but in God. No longer would things be right with the world, for not only did Judaism face troubles from without, but troubles from within. A growing secularism and a clash of cultures with Babylonian, Persian, and later Hellenistic values. Only God could bring order out of this chaos. This emphasis actually is not so much on the hopelessness of the present as upon the hopelessness of the future. Though it may have seemed as if God had disappeared from the scene, the apocalyptic writer is saying that this is illusory. In reality, God still reigns over history, and He will bring it to a close in His own time. The cataclysm would occur within history, and all humankind would see it. The emphasis of the intervention of God in catastrophic fashion, such as the seals, trumpets, and bowls of Revelation 6, 8 through 9, and 16, this triumph would be absolute, visible to all, and would vindicate the faithful. Evil would be stamped out forever, and righteousness prevail. A determinism was observable in which God completely controlled all of history. A very strong predestinarian perspective prevails, as God had already charted the future course of this world. In fact, apocalyptic could be labeled the revelation of this future history preordained by God. In the midst of the persecuted minority among Judaism and the Church, this message held immense comfort. In the present, they saw only the control and triumph of the wicked. The message that this was only temporary and that the future triumph of God and His people was assured. The interpretation of biblical symbolism is actually a special type of metaphor and therefore part of the multiple senses of the semantic range, the complete gamut of how a word is being used by the speakers of a particular language at a particular point in time, as opposed to the interaction of context, the word surrounding a particular word. The task of the interpreters to determine which figurative sense the symbol has in a larger context. This means that the true meaning is not to be found in our present situation, but rather in the use of that symbol in the ancient setting. This point can hardly be overemphasized in light of the misuse of biblical symbolism in many circles today. This does not mean that prophecy and apocalyptic should not be applied to the current situation, nor that their fulfillment should not be sought. Rather, it means that the interpreter should seek first the author's intended meaning in the original context before delineating the way that the prophecies apply to our time. We should not look for the meaning of 666 in Revelation 13:18, in things like the credit card system or names of individuals in our current time, but rather in the context of the first century. At the same time, the purpose of esoteric symbols in Apocalyptic is to turn readers from the actual events to its theological meaning. In other words, readers are expected to see the hand of God in the future, but are not supposed to know the exact sequence of events. That is, they are not given a description of what will actually happen. In short, we have no blueprint in Scripture for current events, but rather theological signs which tell us in general that God is going to draw history to a close. Symbols are literal in that they point to future events, but not so literal that they tell us exactly how God is going to accomplish His purposes. The mental and conceptual idea and the image that represents it stem from the ancient world and the biblical realities of that day. Symbols are actual objects: a boiling pot, a goat or ram, a chariot, often placed in strange combinations: a lion with an eagle's wings, Daniel 7, a beast with 10 horns and 7 heads, Revelation 13, to convey forcefully some religious truth. When the symbols are explained by the biblical authors, as in Zechariah 6, the chariots with red, black, white, tappled horse are heavenly spirits patrolling the 4 corners of the earth. The meaning is self-evident. When it is not, the reader is tempted to give the symbols for more specific meaning than is safe, for they are interpreted on the basis of current cultural meaning. This is bad news. In moving from the symbol to the reality, it envisions the reader should seek first the biblical background behind such symbols and then use this to interpret the latter allusions. For instance, the 4 beasts of Daniel 7 stand for the world empires and their leaders. The use of the beasts in Revelation 13 builds upon Daniel 7 and should be interpreted accordingly. It is debated whether the beasts from the sea of Revelation 13 is a person, the Antichrist, or a world empire. In light of the presence of both in 2 Thessalonians 2, as well as in Daniel, it is doubtful whether such a distinction should be made. Both are correct. The important thing is to allow the background behind the symbol to become a key to unlock its meaning. One caveat is necessary. The past use of a symbol is a pointer to its meaning, but is not determinative in itself. Symbols rarely become absolutely fixed or formalized in meaning. Therefore, we must check the total semantic field, which is a set of words grouped by meaning that refers to a specific subject behind the associative senses of a term, noting both similarities and differences in the uses elsewhere. For instance, the sun can't be used for Judah, Christ, or Satan in various contexts. At the time, the ferocity and predatory nature of the lion is stressed. 1 Peter 5:8 of Satan. At other times, his lordly nature is behind the image. Revelation 5:5. In the latter, in fact, the lion is identified with the lamb slain. Revelation 5:6. A marvelous juxtaposition of images. Naturally, nature qualifies such as a salt used as a preservative or a seasoning. Mark 9:50 often provide a clue as well. If the symbol is interpreted by the author in the passage, that has important repercussions. Not only does the symbol lose its enigmatic character and become a known item, but it also becomes a control for other symbols in the immediate context and in the remainder of the book. We are given a critical clue to the mind of God in the particular vision, which aids us in tracking the progress of the visions elsewhere as they build upon and clarify the one known passage. In Revelation, one like a son of man equals Christ, 1:17 through 18. Golden lampstands equals the seven churches, 1 verse 20. 7 stars equals the 7 angels of the churches, 1:20. Dragons equals Satan, 12 verse 9. 7 heads equals the 7 hills, 17:9, probably Rome, which was built on 7 hills. Harlot equals the great city, 17 verse 18, and again, probably Rome, which was built on 7 hills. These interpreted portions become keys for understanding the other visionary symbols. Remember, theological thrust of the whole passage is a key reminder. Hermeneutical principles. Note the type of literature. It was pointed out above the differences between apocalyptic and prophecy. But the fact is that none of the books are purely apocalyptic. In many of the categories, such as pessimism versus optimism, straightforward language versus cryptic symbolisms, no specification of time versus the division of time into periods, the biblical works are mixed and in many portions are closer to the prophetic. The interpreter must be alert to these categories and work carefully with the smaller units within the larger whole. For example, Zechariah 1 through 6 is primarily apocalyptic, but 7 through 14 is primarily prophetic. Daniel is an obvious blend of the two genres. Revelation does not merely await the eschaton, but has a great interest in the current age, primarily because the present is the age of the Spirit. See 1:10 through 11. Because the book blends apocalyptic form with a prophetic perspective. See 1 verse 8, 19 verse 10, 22 verses 18 and 19. Revelation speaks to the church of John's own day and to the church of every age. Further, John employs the epistolary form, addressing his readers in the customary IU manner. This makes it even more important to recognize the extent to which many of the visions address current situations in John's church and blend the present with the future. Note the structure of the passage or book. Apocalyptic is more literary than oral. The visions were never meant to be individual entities, but rather were given as a part of a larger whole. Note the function and meaning of the symbols. After noting the basic thrust of the whole, one must exegete the parts. This is a necessity of exegesis when studying the book of Revelation, primarily because it is so common to ignore historical factors when interpreting an apocalyptic literature. The prevalence of predictive elements causes the reader to forget the original situation and assent only the futuristic fulfillment, particularly in terms of the current age. Yet, in every case, the author's original meaning must predominate, for it is the key to the fulfillment. First, we must ask whether the symbol is interpreted in the immediate context or elsewhere in the book. If so, this will provide the control for the meaning of those symbols not directly interpreted. Second, we must study the synchronic, in other words, the use of the symbol in literature of the same period, and diachronic, in other words, the use of the symbol in the past parallels. Especially important will be a direct allusion to past texts, such as the use of Ezekiel or Daniel in the book of Revelation. These provide specific help to the meaning of the symbols, although the final arbitrator is still the immediate author's context. We have to stress the theological and note the predictive with humility. This does not mean the futuristic prophecy is not as important as the theological message to the author's own day. The future, even in the Apocalyptic text, was not an end in itself, but a means to an end, namely to comfort and challenge the saints. The cryptic symbols is to keep the reader from giving the future fulfillment to great place the message of the book. The author wanted to turn the reader toward God, not just toward future events. And therefore, the actual event prophesied was clouded in the midst of symbolisms, and the reader had to turn to God who would bring it to pass. The point is as relevant to the church today as it was to Judaism and the church in the past. We often forget how mistakenly Israel interpreted prophecy of the first advent. We have no greater perspective from which of the second advent. We must remember that each era of the church through the ages has believed that Christ would return in its generation. Therefore, we need to stress the theology's meaning of apocalyptic and hold to interpretations of fulfillment in our own day. For example, such as those related to the reinstatement of Israel as a nation with humility. Above all, we dare not preach or teach such prophecies as absolute truth. Otherwise, when they fail to come to pass, people's faith can be hurt and the church made to look foolish. Such occurred recently with respect to some who gave too much credence to the pamphlet promising the Lord's return in 1988. The implications of this for preaching and teaching are enormous. Apocalyptic contains a powerful theological message centering upon the ancient followers of God and their difficult situation. That same message has parallels with and repercussions for the saints of our own day. With unemployment on the rise, a greater amount of worldwide persecution today than ever before in history, and vast uncertainty of the future economically and eschatological, the apocalyptic truths are more needed than ever before. Note the following recapitulation of the book of Revelation and ask the extent to which the historical situation applies today. Dr. Gordon Fee and Dr. Stewart write, "The main themes are absolutely clear. The church and the state are on a collision course, and initial victory will appear to belong to the state. Thus he warns the church that suffering and defeat lie ahead. Indeed, it will get far worse before it gets better." Revelation 6:9 through 11. He is greatly concerned that they do not capitulate in times of duress. 14 verses 11 through 12 and 21 verses 7 through 8. But this prophetic word is also one of encouragement, for God is in control of all things. Christ holds the keys to history, and he holds the churches in his hands. 1 verses 17 through 20. Thus the church triumphs even through death. 12 verse 11. God will finally pour out his wrath upon those who caused that suffering and death and bring eternal rest to those who remain faithful. Even these passages, primarily concerned with the future, apply to the present. For instance, the beast and his forces, the Antichrist of the future, depicted also Rome and the enemies of the church, the many antichrists in John's day. The seals, trumpets, bowls are future outpourings of wrath, but remind the unbelievers of the certainty of God's judgment and the believers of God's future vindication. Above all, note the congruence of present and future throughout biblical apocalyptic literature. There is a very real telescoping of time, throughout which in the New Testament is built upon the tension between the already and the not yet in eschatology of Jesus and the early church. The prophecies regarding the not yet are so closely tied to the already that the two can at times appear to be simultaneous. Therefore, we must avoid dogmatic pronouncements and contrive to address our present in light of the certainty of God's control over history and of His future vindication of His faithful followers and punishment of the wicked. In the next session, we will be talking about the importance of context. Until the next session, Session 9.